Think about this. Over half a century ago, Robert F. Kennedy pointed out something pretty profound.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
He said, you know, we measure all sorts of things with GDP, napalm production, the cost of cleaning up pollution, but we fail to measure the poetry of life, the beauty of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate.
Right. Everything except what makes life worthwhile, essentially.
Exactly. And that fundamental gap, that's really what we're diving into today.
It's amazing how much Kennedy's words still resonate. Because, well, they highlight this crucial truth, don't they? Our usual ways of measuring success.
Yeah, the economic stuff.
They just overlook the very things that give our lives meaning, real value.
Yeah.
We've gotten really good at quantifying, the material world,
Mm-hmm.
but the moral side, the spiritual dimensions, they've mostly stayed outside our spreadsheets.
And that's where this idea, the Universal Value Index, or UVI, comes in. It's a really compelling proposal, I think, a new kind of yardstick.
Exactly. One that tries to move beyond just economics, even beyond standard well-being measures.
To try and integrate those deeper things, the intangibles.
Precisely. Our mission in this deep dive is really to get under the hood of the UVI concept. Especially its, well, let's face it, pretty ambitious goal of bringing moral, even spiritual considerations into a framework that's actually measurable.
Okay. Measurable spirituality. That sounds like a challenge.
It definitely is. But the UVI builds on earlier work, things like the Human Development Index, the World Happiness Report.
Right. Those push the boundaries already.
They did. But the UVI aims to go, well, a significant step further. It suggests we could actually create a shared framework, one reflecting our collective moral and spiritual hopes.
A shared framework, like a compass for civilization.
That's a great way to put it. A compass pointing not just towards, say, economic growth, but also towards our ethical maturity, our spiritual development even.
Okay, so the UVI is built on this idea that deep down there are universal values we can maybe all agree on. What are the core beliefs, the premises that make this whole thing seem, well, possible?
There are a few key ones. First, this idea of universality. That despite all our cultural differences, and they are vast if you dig deep enough, you find this remarkable convergence. Fundamental virtues like compassion, honesty, humility, they pop up everywhere, not just Western ideas.
Okay, universality. What else?
Second, the need for integration. Our modern, often secular metrics, they tend to sideline spiritual development.
Yeah, definitely.
But then traditional religious metrics can be hard to quantify broadly. So the UVI tries to bridge that gap, create a language that works for both secular and spiritual viewpoints.
It's almost like if we can talk about these things more concretely, maybe we can actually work towards them better together.
Precisely, which leads to the third premise. Guidance and accountability. If we can find nuanced ways to measure these often intangible qualities.
Like put some kind of number on compassion, maybe?
Or at least track trends, yeah. Then we can have more informed discussions, see if we're improving or declining in these really crucial areas. It gives us a basis for collective self-assessment. And finally, there's global cohesion. In a world that's so connected, but also, frankly, often polarized.
Tell me about it.
A shared index of fundamental values could be, maybe, a neutral touchstone for dialogue, allowing us to learn from each other about living a good life beyond just economics or, power politics.
Those premises, they sound good, aspirational. But my mind immediately jumps to the dangers. I mean, trying to measure something so personal, so subjective, spirituality, it feels like it could get reductive or even misused.
You're absolutely right to flag those caveats. And the thinkers behind this are very aware of the risks. The aim is definitely not to create some simplistic or worse oppressive tool.
Right. No spiritual leaderboard.
No, not ranking souls, not imposing some ideology. It's more about fostering a shared vocabulary, a way to talk about virtue, about meaning, to gauge maybe at a societal level those qualities that really enrich human life. Respectfully, across religious and secular lines.
So less a scoreboard, more a shared understanding of what we value, collectively.
Exactly. Shared aspiration, striving together. But as you said, getting there means navigating some really profound challenges.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest is ensuring our measurement is grounded in truth. This idea of epistemic virtue, we'll get into that. Then there's the whole complex role of myth and narrative in shaping values. How do we handle that?
Myths.
And finally, just respecting the ineffable nature of spiritual experience, approaching it with humility.
Right. So this isn't going to be easy. What's the plan for this deep dive then? What ground are we covering?
We'll start with that foundation. Epistemic virtue. the importance of seeking truth, and the huge hurdle of self-deception.
Okay, truth first.
Then we'll look at myth, making a distinction between myths that genuinely guide us well and maybe those that don't, which leads naturally to the Buddhist idea of upaya, skillful means. Fascinating concept.
Upaya, got it.
Then we'll consider what mystics across different traditions say about ultimate reality, that consistent message they seem to share.
Ah, the mystics.
Which paves the way to explore those shared spiritual values that seem to pop up everywhere, transcending religious boundaries. And finally, we'll tackle the how. Different ways to maybe measure spiritual maturity and how to integrate all these diverse traditions respectfully into one index.
Wow. Okay. That's ambitious, but also feels deeply necessary somehow. Trying to quantify the unquantifiable, honor the richness of myth, find common ground, all for humanity's search for meaning.
That's the hope. So let's lay that crucial foundation, epistemic virtue, the pursuit of truth, and that constant struggle with self-deception.
Epistemic virtue. Okay, you break that down for me. Sounds a bit philosophical. What does it mean in practice for you or me?
At its heart, it's really just about having good intellectual habits. When you form your beliefs, be responsible about it. Think of it like an ethical code for your own mind.
Okay, like what kind of habits?
Things like intellectual honesty, being truthful about what you know, and crucially, what you don't know. Intellectual humility, being open-minded, and really actively guarding against our tendency to fool ourselves.
So, trying to be accurate in our thinking. Why is that the starting point for a spiritual values index? Feels like we're starting with logic when spirituality often feels, well, beyond logic.
It's foundational because without that commitment to truth, any value system, no matter how noble it sounds, can get twisted, become harmful even. History is full of examples, right? Ideologies, religious or secular, that led to awful things because they were built on shaky ground or just refused to face inconvenient truths.
Right.
So if the UVI is going to be genuinely useful, help us flourish, it has to be rooted in a sincere effort to understand reality, both inner and outer reality. And that starts with valuing truthfulness in our own heads, the core idea. Any measure of goodness has to start with a commitment to truth. Otherwise,
the UVI just measures how good we are at kidding ourselves.
Exactly. It risks becoming a measure of self-delusion, not genuine value.
And that's where self-deception is such a killer obstacle. We can't build on a foundation if it's warped by what we wish was true.
Precisely. Self-deception is basically the opposite of epistemic virtue. It's holding a belief not because the evidence points that way, but because deep down we want it to be true.
Motivated irrationality, I think I've heard it called.
That's it. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy uses that term. And it's so tricky because it often works subconsciously. We get really good at rationalizing, cherry-picking evidence, all to protect a belief that meets some emotional need.
That feels very human. It's much easier to believe things that confirm our biases or make us feel good. So how do we fight that, individually and in building something like the UVI?
Well, scholars suggest two main paths. First, consciously cultivating those epistemic virtues, trying to be impartial, being really self-aware about our biases, meticulous about finding information, and having the guts to face uncomfortable truths.
Like a scientist checking their data, but for our core beliefs.
Kind of, yeah. And second, by being part of an epistemic community, a group, a culture that actually values evidence and reason and holds people accountable.
Ah, so having others challenge you.
Exactly. That kind of community is vital. It helps expose our blind spots, corrects our individual biases.
Makes sense. Having people around who will call you out, even if it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So how does this connect specifically to spirituality, this focus on honesty and truth?
Well, interestingly, lots of spiritual traditions really emphasize intellectual honesty as part of the path. Think about confession in Christianity, stripping away illusions about ourselves.
Okay.
Or in Buddhism, right, understanding, seeing things as they truly are is the very first step on the Eightfold Path. Even modern cognitive science hints at this tension between, say, useful positive illusions and maybe deeper spiritual truths. Often, real spiritual growth demands a kind of bravery, facing hard realities about ourselves, about the world.
So for the UVI, how does this grounding in epistemic virtue keep it real?
Yeah.
Stop it becoming just wishful thinking.
It means we have to prioritize reliable evidence whenever we can. Empirical data on behavior, measurable outcomes, validated psych assessments. It means constantly subjecting even our most cherished values to critique. Yeah. And crucially, fighting confirmation bias that pull towards info that just confirms what we already believe while ignoring anything that contradicts it.
And intellectual humility must be huge here, too, right? Admitting we don't have all the answers, especially with spirituality.
Absolute crucial. Recognizing our limits, that's intellectual humility, and it's vital in spirituality, where so much is beyond empirical proof. A virtuous approach here means not claiming certainty lightly, embracing some uncertainty, some mystery. And it's fascinating, as we'll see with the mystics, this kind of humility is often a sign of deep spiritual insight. The wisest people tend to assert less, inquire more, and practically for the UVI, it means it has to be an ongoing process. Revision, learning, being willing to be wrong, treating the index like a living thing that evolves as we understand more.
You mentioned earlier that scary idea. A society scoring high on a spiritual index, but actually being lost in mass delusions. Why is self-deception such a massive threat to the UVI?
Well, imagine leaders or whole communities getting convinced they're super spiritually evolved, right? And therefore morally superior.
Yeah.
But in reality, they're blinded by, I don't know, unchecked greed, deep prejudice, rigid ideology. History has grim examples of supposedly righteous movements whose self-image was totally disconnected from their actual impact.
Yeah, tragically so.
If the UVI became a tool for that kind of large-scale self-deception, it would be worse than useless. It could actually reinforce harm by giving it a fake moral justification.
So how do we build in safeguards, checks and balances against this?
One key way is robust feedback loops. Independent auditing of the data, the analysis, just like in good science, actively seeking critique is vital.
From who?
From a diverse range of experts. Scholars from different religions, secular ethicists, even constructive skeptics. That creates the epistemic community we need to spot collective blind spots.
Right.
So, for example, if a country reports super high compassion scores on surveys, but other data, like refugee acceptance rates or charitable giving, tells a different story, that gap needs investigating, openly, not glossed over. The UVI has to be an honest mirror, even if the reflection is uncomfortable. That's the only way it spurs real growth.
So epistemic virtue is the absolute bedrock, making sure the UVI is built on genuine truth-seeking, not wishful thinking or bias.
Precisely. It has to align with beliefs that actually work in the real world, help us understand reality better. Anything less is flawed. And with that foundation set, we can now turn to the fascinating, often tricky role of myth. Because any value system, spiritual or cultural, gets passed down through powerful stories.
Okay, so truth-seeking first. Now, myth. This feels like a totally different way of knowing. What do we need to grasp about myths for this UVI idea?
Well, humans are storytellers, right? And myths, these big narratives, origin stories, shared legends, they've always been central to how we make sense of things, how we transmit core values.
Sure. They shape cultures?
Hugely. They can inspire virtue, forge strong communities, but they can also be deceptive, divisive even. History shows us both sides. So, for the UVI, a helpful distinction we found was between mimetic myths and meritocratic myths.
Mimetic and meritocratic. Okay, unpack those terms.
Sure. Mimetic myths, from mimesis or imitation, are stories that spread and last, not because they're true or good necessarily, but because they're really good at replicating themselves. They're mimetically sticky, like cultural viruses almost.
Pretty cow.
They often tap into basic fears, desires, tribal instincts. They spread easily, get imitated, and often believing them gives some social advantage, maybe boosting group cohesion against outsiders or justifying power structures.
Okay, so it's less about the myth's content and more about its spreadability.
In a way, yes. For mimetic myths, that's often key. Now, meritocratic myths are different. They persist because they actually earn their keep. They demonstrably guide people toward beneficial outcomes.
Beneficial how?
Maybe fostering ethical improvement, deeper spiritual insight, overall flourishing. They have inherent merit. They contain real wisdom or provoke growth. That's why generations keep finding value in them, often regardless of literal historical truth.
So it's about results, about genuine value.
Exactly, but it's not always a clean split. Most enduring myths probably have elements of both mimetic and meritocratic.
Can you give some solid examples to really see the difference?
Okay, a classic mimetic myth might be, say, a xenophobic folktale, one that paints outsiders as inherently monstrous or dangerous.
Right, unfortunately common.
These stories catch on, especially in tense times. They unite the in-group through shared fear. They justify discrimination, the factual accuracy, dubious, ethical merit, questionable, but it spreads because it's socially useful in a narrow, often harmful way, binds the group.
Any modern examples?
Sure, think of certain conspiracy theories that spread like wildfire online, or propaganda narratives that tap into strong emotions, reinforce group identity, even if they're factually baseless.
And how does this link back to that research you mentioned about historical myths driving conflict?
Exactly. Cultural evolution research supports this strongly. That 2024 study in behavioral and brain sciences, it argued that historical myths succeed culturally because they help us recruit support for big collective actions, like war.
So shared belief in a myth helps groups cooperate, even for bad things.
Often, yes. A powerful shared myth, heroic ancestry, divine favor makes groups better at coordinating. These myths act like super stimuli in our social brains, signaling us versus them. The literal truth often doesn't matter as much as the shared belief itself. Think national founding myths, stories of chosen peoples.
So while mimetic myths bind groups, they could really undermine universal values if they define us against them negatively.
Precisely. They create divisions. And if a myth's strength is just its spreadability or its use in power struggles, not its truth or moral merit, it can actually block ethical progress, especially if it glorifies violence, conquest, subjugation.
Okay, that's the potential dark side. What about meritocratic myths? What makes
Meritocratic myths endure because they genuinely resonate with deep human truths. They guide us towards positive growth. Think wisdom stories, teaching tales,
Right.
religious parables, moral fables.
like the Good Samaritan?
Perfect example. A powerful story about compassion transcending prejudice. It resonates across cultures for centuries, not by force, but because people recognize its moral merit. Or Buddhist Jataka tells stories of the Buddha's past lives, valued not as literal history, but for their lessons on generosity, patience, wisdom.
So it's about their transformative power, fostering growth, deeper understanding, virtue.
Exactly. A meritocratic myth is like a seed of insight. When you internalize it, it often genuinely affects you, shapes you for the better, gives you deeper understanding. As one author put it, a true myth isn't just empirical propositions, it's a way of being and experiencing. It gives life its point.
That connects to how myths were seen before modern times, right?
Yes. Karen Armstrong talks about mythos and logos as distinct realms. Logos was pragmatic reason, facts. Mythos dealt with the deeper, elusive stuff, meaning the question wasn't did this literally happen, but what does this teach us about life? Creation myths, for instance, not proto-science, but therapy, inspiration, a program of action.
So meritocratic myths last because of their spiritual or moral effectiveness.
Precisely. Now, here's the tricky part for the UVI. The relationship between myth and truth. A myth can be factually false, yet spiritually true, conveying deep truths about humanity, the divine, the cosmos.
Right.
But a myth can also be factually false and spiritually unhelpful, even harmful, promoting bad values or biases. So the UVI has to grapple with this ambiguity. We can't dismiss all myths, we'd lose too much wisdom, but we can't accept them all uncritically either.
So the challenge is discerning which myths are genuinely beneficial, aligned with those universal values. How do we separate the wheat from the chaff?
It's fundamentally about looking at the underlying message and its effects. A myth saying, our group is chosen to rule others, probably chaff. Mimetic, reinforcing power.
Yeah.
A myth saying the universe began in harmony, all beings share a divine spark. Might be wheat, more unifying, inspiring, even if not empirically provable.
Mere examples.
Sure. The historical blood libel against Jews, clearly mimetic, toxic chaff, fueled persecution, the Bhagavad Gita, full of meritocratic, philosophical, and ethical teachings that guide millions.
And some myths mix elements.
Definitely. Noah's Ark, maybe. Profound lessons about responsibility, renewal, but also potential for exclusivist readings about who gets saved. Interpretation is key.
So for the UVI, the attitude needs to be meritocratic. Value myths for cultivating virtue, but be wary of self-serving or groupthink ones.
Exactly. The UVI doesn't need to rule on supernatural claims. The focus should be on outcomes. Does believing this myth tend to make people more compassionate, wise, humble, connected to reality? Or does it lead to bigotry, complacency, arrogance, delusion? Those are the empirical and ethical questions. And this leads us to a really helpful concept from Buddhism that sheds more light on how myths, even untrue ones, can be skillfully used.
Ah, you mean upaya. Skillful means. How does that help us understand myths' role?
Upaya, yeah. Skillful or expedient means. It's a core Mahayana Buddhist idea. It suggests an enlightened teacher might use methods or teachings that are most effective for guiding someone, even if those teachings aren't ultimately or literally true in the highest sense.
So a myth, a story, a ritual. It could be like temporary scaffolding, helping someone climb higher spiritually, then maybe they set it aside.
That's a perfect analogy, scaffolding. The myth is a tool, valuable not for its absolute accuracy, but for the good results it helps produce.
Is that like the Buddha's raft analogy?
Exactly. He said his teachings, the Dharma, are like a raft across the river of suffering. Once you reach the other shore of liberation, you don't keep carrying the raft on your head.
That makes sense.
The teachings, myths, rituals, they're means to an end, not the end itself. Clinging to them after they've served their purpose, that's seen as folly. An attachment that hinders progress. Non-attachment, even to sacred concepts.
You mentioned a parable from the Lotus Sutra, the burning house.
Yes, a famous one. A father finds his house on fire, kids inside, oblivious, playing. He shouts. They ignore him. So skillful means. He yells, "Hey, amazing carts and toys out here for you."
A lie, basically.
A compassionate one. They rush out, intrigued, safety, and then he gives them even better gifts than promised. The toys were apaya. The lie saved them. The sutra uses this to explain why Buddha sometimes taught simpler, provisional truths, stepping stones out of suffering.
So the myth of the toys wasn't literally true, but served a greater truth, saving the children. What are the implications for how we view myths in different traditions?
Upaya suggests that spiritually mature traditions often know they're using myths and symbols as tools, fingers pointing at the moon, not the moon itself.
That's sane.
It's a humble approach, acknowledging that any formulation is incomplete, but it might be the right medicine for someone at some stage. Different skillful means might even seem contradictory because people need different things.
So how do we apply this to the UVI? How can we respect myths for their function without getting stuck on literal truth?
Upaya gives us a framework. We can validate myths based on their pragmatic spiritual function. The question shifts from, is this creation story factually true, to,
how does believing or practicing this story lead to virtue or awakening? And how can we measure that?
Exactly. Treat myths as symbolic scaffolding. Respect them for their power to inspire transformation, not necessarily historical accuracy.
Could you give a practical example for the UVI?
Sure. Take prayer. A literal view, petitioning a deity who intervenes.
No.
A secular rationalist view dismisses it as myth. An Upaya perspective looks at what prayer does.
Okay, what does it do?
It often cultivates humility, gratitude, compassion. Psych studies show correlations between devotional practices and less stress, more well-being, pro-social behavior.
Right, measurable outcomes.
So the literal myth of the intervening deity might not be verifiable, but the virtues prayer fosters, humility, gratitude, compassion, are measurable, at least partly. The UVI could measure those virtues, indirectly acknowledging prayer's value in fostering them without judging the metaphysics.
That's a clever way to bridge belief and outcome. Are there similar ideas in other traditions outside Buddhism?
Oh, absolutely. In Hinduism, Ishvara Pranitana, devotion to a chosen deity in yoga, can be seen as a skillful means to let go of ego, cultivate surrender, even if understanding of the divine evolves. C.S. Lewis saw children's simpler faith as a valid step towards mature understanding. St. Paul spoke of putting aside childish things as spiritual growth happens. Sufi Islam uses rich symbolic poetry metaphors as upaya to evoke love for the divine.
So seeing myth as skillful means helps diffuse conflicts between literalists and rationalists, offers a middle path focused on transformation.
Exactly, respecting the power and wisdom without demanding literal belief. But there's a big caution. Upaya works best with awareness of its provisional nature.
What's the danger?
When the tools become rigid dogma, when people mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon.
Idolizing the method instead of the goal.
Precisely. That's the wisdom behind radical Zen sayings like, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. It's about breaking attachment to any fixed concept or form to reach the formless reality.
Wow. Heavy. How does that relate back to the UVI?
It's a reminder that any metrics, any codified values we create for the UVI, they're also a kind of raft.
Okay.
Provisional. We need to know their limits. Be ready for them to become obsolete as people grow spiritually, which would actually be a success.
Paradoxical.
Yeah. The focus should stay on the manifest virtues, compassion, serenity, wisdom, not just the doctoral doxes. Upaya teaches us, look beyond form to function to outcome. And this idea that myth and even our measures are provisional, it sets us up perfectly to hear from the mystics. Those who often say ultimate truth is beyond all words, all myths.
Okay, so after exploring myth as skillful means, we're turning to the mystics. What do they consistently tell us about ultimate reality and the role of myth?
It's one of the most striking things when you study mystics across different world religions, this recurring message about ultimate reality. People who claim direct transformative experience often report that this reality is fundamentally ineffable, utterly beyond language, concepts, even the rich symbols and myths of their own traditions.
Beyond words.
Completely. They often suggest that the familiar doctrines, the theologies, the sacred stories, they're partial pointers at best, provisional, not the ultimate reality itself. The further you go in direct experience, the more limited all myths and symbols seem.
That's powerful and humbling. Can you share some examples from different traditions?
Absolutely. Rumi, the Sufi mystic, famously said, "Silence is the language of God, all else is poor translation." He also wrote about a field beyond all notions of right and wrong, implying a unity that transcends our usual moral categories, which are often tied to myths.
Wow.
In Christianity, Thomas Aquinas, a giant of theology. After a profound mystical experience late in life, he said all his writings seemed like so much straw compared to what was revealed.
So much straw from Aquinas. It's incredible. What about Eastern traditions?
In Hinduism, the Upanishads use paradox. They say Brahman, ultimate reality, is that which one cannot express in words, but by which the tongue speaks. The whole neti-neti approach, not this, not that.
Defining by negation.
Right. And many Hindu sages see the personal gods as provisional forms of the formless Brahman. In Buddhism, especially Zen, huge emphasis on the ineffability of nirvana, of sunyata, emptiness, using nonverbal transmission koans to bypass language.
Like the Tao Te Ching saying, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao.
Exactly. Or those who know do not speak, those who speak do not know. The Diamond Sutra says any fixed idea of the Buddha or enlightenment is itself an illusion. And in Kabbalah, the highest aspect of God is Ein Sof without end, infinite, beyond all finite description.
So despite vastly different frameworks, this consistent message, ultimate truth is ungraspable by language, by concepts. What are the implications of that for our UVI?
Several big ones. First, it strongly suggests no single myth or doctrine can dominate the UVI. The focus has to be on universal experiences and virtues, compassion, unity, love, ego surrender. Because the deepest wisdom in all traditions admits its own limits in describing the ultimate.
Okay, focus on the common fruits, not the specific theological roots.
Well put. Second, it highlights the value of intellectual humility and open-mindedness. Mystics often embody this humility, recognizing the limits of understanding. And research, like the Spiritual Experience Index, finds correlations between spiritual maturity and lower dogmatism, greater tolerance for ambiguity.
So maybe the UVI should see dogmatism as a negative indicator and comfort with mystery as a positive one.
It's a fascinating possibility, isn't it? Seeing comfort with ambiguity, not as confusion, but maybe a sign of deeper wisdom, aligns with the mystical view that our maps aren't the territory.
Right.
And third, mystics powerfully reinforce that idea of myth as means, not end, upaya. They basically say, the myths were helpful guides, but ultimately I had to see beyond them.
So the UVI should value metaphorical flexibility, not literalism.
Yes, maybe even include survey items gauging literal versus metaphorical understanding of religious teachings. Research by Virginia found higher spiritual maturity scorers see faith as a personal quest and score lower on authoritarianism. It fits.
So the mystics point to a shared reality beneath the surface differences. How do we square that with all the different names and forms for the divine?
There's that beautiful line from Kabir, the 15th century mystic. Allah, Ram, Karim, Kisav, I serve the one who is behind all names. It captures that intuition of oneness behind the diversity. And that intuition brings us naturally to a really encouraging point. Despite theological clashes, there's remarkable convergence on core shared spiritual and ethical values across religions, a strong foundation for the UVI.
That's hopeful. That beneath the surface fights, there's common ethical ground. What are some of these shared values you see across traditions?
It really is striking when you look. Major world religions consistently emphasize a similar set of core values. Things like compassion, love, kindness, honesty, truthfulness, humility, forgiveness, peace, generosity, self-discipline, gratitude.
Wow, quite a list.
Yeah. Now, different traditions might emphasize certain virtues more, use different language, obviously, but the fundamental overlap is significant. Scholars call it the perennial ethics, or the common ground.
Can you give an example, like compassion? How does that show up everywhere?
Absolutely. Compassion, empathy, acting with care for others' suffering. In Buddhism, karuna, compassion is central. Jesus taught loving your neighbor, even enemies. Islam describes God as Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the most compassionate, the most merciful, and urges compassion for the poor. Hinduism upholds Dade, compassion, Confucianism has random benevolence at its heart.
Karen Armstrong said compassion is the core value all religions share, right?
She did. And think about the golden rule, treat others as you want to be treated. It appears in some form virtually everywhere.
That's powerful. What about other values, similar convergence?
Yes, generally. Humility, avoiding arrogance, praised everywhere. Honesty, truthfulness, almost universally essential. Lying, deceit condemned. Most traditions teach some non-attachment to stuff, moderation in desires.
And these ethical basics aren't usually what religions fight about.
Generally not. Even when theology or rituals clash wildly, you don't find mainstream religions promoting greed or cruelty as virtues. This shared moral landscape was key to the Parliament of the World's Religions Global Ethic Declaration back in '93.
What did that say?
Leaders from tons of faiths affirmed common core values, nonviolence, justice, truthfulness, partnership, care for Earth as essential for a sustainable world.
So this common ground is where the universal in UVI can actually be built.
Exactly. It shows universal values aren't just a dream. We can carefully derive a list of core virtues that show up consistently. Candidates would be compassion, honesty, justice, nonviolence, generosity, humility, perseverance, gratitude, self-control, maybe spiritual openness or seeking meaning.
And these often map onto psychological frameworks too, right? Like character strengths.
They do, suggesting a deeper resonance in human psychology.
But how do we actually measure these? They still feel abstract, even if we agree they're important.
Well, while they're concepts, they do tend to show up in observable behaviors and attitudes. That's the key. We can gauge them, partly. Frequency of altruism, charitable giving for compassion, corruption levels as a negative proxy for honesty, how leaders handle criticism for humility. It's not perfect, exhaustive measurement, but it gives us data points.
And the overlap allows for a common language, without getting stuck in specific religious terms, making it relevant for secular people too.
Exactly. Secular ethics also champion these values: benevolence, fairness, care. Empirical research, like Shalom Schwartz's work on universal values, benevolence, universalism, points this way too. Jonathan Haidt's Moral Foundation's wide agreement on care, fairness, even sanctity often connects to self-control, nonviolence in religious contexts.
Of course, values can conflict sometimes.
Right. Which highlights the need for wisdom, discernment. Maybe the UVI needs to account for that meta-virtue somehow. But the broad agreement is a solid foundation. We can imagine UVI categories like compassionate love, respect for truth, justice, nonviolence, humility, temperance, spiritual understanding, openness.
So we have potential shared values. Now, the really hard part, how do we measure these reliably? Quantify spiritual maturity without, crushing the nuance out of it.
You've hit the absolute core challenge, measuring the immeasurable. Seems paradoxical. But the key, we think, is a fundamentally multidimensional approach, acknowledging complexity, deliberately avoiding simplistic reductionism.
Why multidimensional?
Because spirituality isn't one thing. Research shows that clearly. Someone might be deeply ritualistic but not very ethical. Someone else might have profound mystical experiences but no formal religion.
Right. Different facets.
So we need to measure different dimensions separately. Experience, mystical, transcendent. Ideology, values, beliefs, practice, public, private. Ethical conduct. Psychological correlates. Tools like the BMMRS brief multidimensional measure of religiousness spirituality try to do this.
So not one single spirituality score, but a profile across dimensions.
What else? Second, adopting a developmental perspective. Some measures try to gauge stages or orientation in understanding. Think James Fowler's Stages of Faith. Or that Spiritual Experience Index, SEI, we mentioned correlating maturity with less dogmatism, more tolerance of ambiguity, intrinsic motivation, questing spirit.
So growth isn't just more belief, but a shift in how you believe.
Exactly. Third, behavioral indicators. Values show up in actions. Frequency of volunteering, demonstrated empathy, ethical choices, nonviolence, self-control, community involvement, even humility indicators like apologizing or seeking advice. No single behavior proves enlightenment, obviously,
right,
but aggregated data across many indicators. That offers insights.
And getting different perspectives is key too, right? Not just self-reporting.
Absolutely. Fourth, combining self-report with peer reports or informant ratings. Self-report captures internal states. Peer reports catch biases, gaps between words and deeds.
Okay. And finally, avoid boiling it all down.
Yes. Avoid that single, simple score. A multifaceted profile, maybe a radar chart, is much better, more transparent, less reductionist, acknowledges the complexity.
You mentioned the Fetzer Institute's recommendations.
Yeah, they and the National Institute on Aging really pushed this multidimensional view, warned against combining diverse things into one religiosity scale, because different facets have different effects. They also stressed including measures for potentially unhealthy religious attitudes. Not all spirituality is positive. A nuanced UVI needs that too.
So can you give more concrete examples, metrics the UVI might actually use?
Sure. For compassional altruism, scales on helping behaviors, donations, empathy attitudes. For ethical integrity, self-report, scenario questions, maybe carefully use public data like corruption indices or criminal records, with huge caveats on ethics and privacy.
Okay. What else?
Ego, transcendence, humility. Items on admitting ignorance, seeing oneself as part of a whole, inverse items on seeking attention, maybe receptivity to criticism, spiritual openness quest. Adapt items from existing quest scales, tolerance items, inner peace mindfulness. Use validated scales, community ritual participation, frequency, and importantly, negative indicators, measures for authoritarian fundamentalism, spiritual bypassing, hypocrisy gaps.
It sounds complex, but potentially really insightful, drawing on lots of tools. But how do we keep it from becoming just numbers? Ensure it stays meaningful, not reductionist.
By constantly contextualizing the scores. A low score on traditional ritual might mean little if someone has deep solitary practice. Supplementing numbers with qualitative data narratives, case studies, regular review by a diverse expert panel to catch biases, ensure we're not missing dimensions.
And accepting limits.
And accepting not everything needs a number. The purpose isn't a spiritual scoreboard, it's illumination. Inspiring self-reflection, societal progress, understanding what contributes to a meaningful life. Think of it like a doctor assessing overall health with many indicators, not just temperature.
That health analogy helps. Complexity, interconnectedness.
Exactly. Communities could use UVI results, find strengths, maybe charity and weaknesses, maybe tolerance, develop strategies. It's encouraging that similar efforts exist spiritual metrics in education. Churches seeking better health indicators, the Human Flourishing Index includes meaning and character.
So quantifying the spiritual is feasible, if done carefully.
Feasible, yes. If thoughtful, multidimensional, evidence-based, humble, metrics can become a common language for discussing progress and virtues. Imagine reports tracking societal compassion or intolerance.
So we have ideas on what and how to measure. Now the integration piece. How do we bring diverse, often myth-rich traditions into the UVI respectfully, without bias or watering them down? Feels like walking a tightrope.
It is, absolutely. Ensuring the UVI is truly universal, respecting that incredible diversity, especially traditions rich in myth, ritual, symbol, is paramount. It needs to feel fair, illuminating to everyone.
What are the key strategies for that kind of pluralistic integration?
One fundamental strategy, focus on the underlying shared values, not literal beliefs or specific rituals. Evaluate values in action, the fruits of the spirit, not theological assent or specific practices.
So focus on love, kindness, forgiveness, peace, not the specific ceremony.
Exactly. That allows people from vastly different paths to see their core values reflected, even if they express them differently.
Okay, focus on outcomes. What else?
Using mythos-logos bilingualism. Present the UVI framework in logos terms, clear, rational language data. But when talking to specific communities, allow mythos interpretations. Frame it in ways that resonate with their narratives.
How would that work?
For Christians, maybe draw parallels to Christ's teachings. For Buddhists, connect to compassion, mindfulness. Find resonant language in Islam, Hinduism, secular humanism, so it doesn't feel alien, but aligns with their own ideals.
Skillful translation, essentially. What about involving the traditions directly?
Crucial. Actively encourage participation, co-creation by religious scholars, leaders, practitioners from all backgrounds. An interfaith advisory group is vital. Ensures inclusivity, identifies biases. The Parliament of Religion's global ethic is a precedent. Building it together fosters understanding. Legitimacy.
So it's not asking people to ditch their myths, but see how they connect to these broader UVI values.
Precisely. The UVI should explicitly affirm the value of myths and rituals as carriers of these values, not replacing them, but learning from them, celebrating the shared lessons.
But what about when a tradition's myth or doctrine seems to clash with universal values? That seems tricky.
It is delicate. The approach, ideally guided by that interfaith group, should be to evaluate based on the highest, most widely embraced interpretations within that tradition, not isolated literal readings or extremist views.
Focusing on the best version of each tradition.
Right. Many scholars within faiths already do this kind of progressive interpretation. Aligning with reformist, humanistic voices implicitly supports more meritocratic, inclusive myths without directly attacking specific beliefs.
Thoughtful navigation. Other strategies.
Adopting that two-level communication, recognizing devout people can hold internal absolutes but support external pluralism. The UVI focuses on societal practice of virtues. Also, huge cultural sensitivity in metrics. Virtues manifest differently. Engage anthropologists. Test phrasing across cultures. Maybe allow culturally specific virtues linked to universal categories.
Like filial piety linking to respect or care.
Potentially, yes. And using apaya in promoting the UVI, different rhetorical myths for different audiences, secular versus religious. Maybe reference historical golden ages of cooperation. Integrating UVI into education, including religious ed, is a long-term strategy too.
It sounds like a very nuanced, collaborative approach is needed.
Absolutely. It's about translation, collaboration, helping the diverse myths become varied clothing on the common body of human ethics, not isolating shells. And with that integration in mind, we can now sketch out a practical roadmap for actually implementing this.
Okay, we've got the philosophy, the integration strategies. Let's get down to brass tacks. What would a concrete roadmap for implementing the UVI spiritual dimension look like?
Well, taking this from concept to reality, it's complex, ambitious. Our roadmap sees it as iterative, multi-year, needing massive collaboration. We picture 4 key phases.
Right, phase 1, what's the focus?
Phase 1, conceptual development and stakeholder alignment. First, crucial action. Establish a multidisciplinary core team. Religious scholars, diverse faiths, philosophers, ethics, epistemology, psychologists, sociologists, data scientists, secular reps, voices from the global south, indigenous traditions, essential to avoid bias.
Getting the right brains trust together. Then what?
Action 1.2. Articulate guiding principles, a foundational document. UVI should be universal but pluralistic, non-dogmatic, evidence-based, development-oriented, respectful, iterative. Draw on the global ethic, maybe RFK's words.
Setting the ground rules.
Action 1.3. Engage key global organizations. UN, World Values Survey folks, OECD, Parliament of World Religions, Vatican, others. Build support, endorsements, collaboration channels, legitimacy and resources.
Building alliances.
And Action 1.4, terminology consensus. Finalize the core values virtues list. Agree on neutral, accessible terms. Define spiritual maturity carefully for the UVI context.
So phase 1 is all about foundations, alignment, shared understanding. What about phase 2?
Phase 2, metric development and pilot testing. Action 2.1. Metric design workshops. Subcommittees develop specific metrics, survey questions, data proxies, behavioral indicators, maybe weighting ideas. Need that multi-dimensional view.
Getting into the nuts and bolts of measuring.
Action 2.2. Cultural validation. Translate, adapt metrics. Run focus groups, cognitive testing in diverse communities. Ensure questions are understood, relevant, accurate across cultures. Crucial step.
Testing if it actually works on the ground.
Exactly. Action 2.3, small-scale pilots, choose diverse test sites worldwide. Administer surveys, collect initial data. Action 2.4, refine metrics using data. Analyze pilot results, reliability, validity, bias. Adjust wording, structure, maybe add drop items based on evidence.
Data-driven improvement.
Action 2.5, develop scoring system, how to calculate, composite score, subscores, weighting, evidence, consensus, public input. Action 2.6, ensure secular scientific rigor, peer review metrics, framework, publish in academic journals. Build credibility, ensure soundness.
Phase 2 sounds intense, grounding it all empirically. Once you have tested metrics, then phase 3, rollout.
Yes. Phase 3, launch and data collection. Action 3.1, global rollout of survey. Partner with international survey orgs or create a dedicated platform. Aim for representative global data. Integrate existing relevant data too.
That went big.
Action 3.2, data platform and privacy. Build secure database. Guarantee anonymity. Clear data use agreements. Ethical handling is paramount. Action 3.3, compute scores and index rankings, if applicable. Generate virtue profiles. Decide how to present rankings very carefully, with caveats.
Right, the ranking danger again.
Action 3.4, publish the UVI report, a major milestone. Comprehensive report, framework, methods, findings, regional country profiles, value gaps, leader commentary, accessible, translated. Action 3.5, media and public engagement. Promote UVI constructively. Highlight strengths, growth areas, involve influencers, maybe awards for positive examples. Foster broad public dialogue.
Getting the word out, making it part of the conversation. What's the long game? Phase 4, iteration, integration, application.
Yes, Phase 4 is about long-term impact, sustainability. Action 4.1, annual periodic updates. Repeat data collection, track trends, continuously refine metrics based on research, feedback, keep it living.
Learning and improving over time.
Action 4.2, policy and community application. Work with pilot communities on action plans. Encourage governments to consider UVI insights, education, social policy. Integrate with SDGs. Action 4.3, grassroots movements. Encourage bottom-up engagement, faith groups, schools, maybe a global values week.
Making it real at local levels.
Action 4.4, evolution of myths. Observe long-term potential influence on religious teaching, maybe emergence of new myths celebrating universal values. Action 4.5, continuous dialogue and research. Host symposia, support academic research on impact, document successes, lessons. Action 4.6, expand and refine dimensions. Over time, maybe add other aspects, relationship with nature, mental well-being.
It paints a really compelling picture. A long-term evolving effort towards a more values-driven world. What's the ultimate destination you see, if this works?
The ultimate destination. Maybe a world with a more unified yet still diverse global consciousness around fundamental human values. Imagine UVI reports discussed alongside GDP. Countries taking pride in ethical progress, not just economic output.
Yeah.
Media spotlighting heroes of virtue. Education focused on character. A positive revival of core values in religious and secular life. Nations inspired by Bhutan's gross national happiness, striving for citizens' ethical and spiritual well-being.
It's an inspiring vision.
Yeah.
And you've consistently stressed the limits, the need for humility.
Absolutely. We have to remember the UVI, any index, is just a limited map of a complex reality. It's a raft, not the shore.
Right.
But it holds huge potential as a catalyst for growth to make those interfaith affirmations, those philosophies, operational, maybe contributing to what some call a new axial age where our ethical maturity starts catching up with our technology.
So what's the key takeaway for our listeners today? What can we do with this?
Ultimately, it often comes back to that timeless advice. Be the change you wish to see. The UVI offers a potential framework to understand that change, measure it societally, inspire more of it in our own lives, our communities.
Like a mirror.
Exactly, a mirror for civilizational self-realization, reflecting our shared light, guiding us in all our diversity towards greater compassion, wisdom, towards a truly worthwhile existence.
A fascinating and truly ambitious undertaking. Thank you for taking this deep dive into the Universal Value Index with me. For those of you listening who want to dig deeper into the source material, we've put a comprehensive list of references on our website. Check the show notes for links covering everything from the limits of GDP to myth, skillful means, mystical testimonies, the global ethic, and the challenges of measuring spirituality. It's a rich landscape of ideas to keep exploring.